Well, greetings once again from Cooperstown, New York, site of the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. It's a beautiful fall day in upstate New York. We're very glad you could join us for our latest virtual Voices of the Game program. We're going to be talking to Alice Kamps, the museum curator, National Archives Museum, about their brand new exhibit. It's an exhibit about sports in general, All-American, the power of sports, but there are a number of baseball-related artifacts and documents that we will talk about during the course of about the next hour or so. For those of you who are new to our virtual programs, my name is Bruce Markason, and I work in the education department here at the Hall of Fame. I'm not a curator, but I do work in education and host these programs that we do. We have Hall of Famers on, former players, experts from our staff, and experts from other museums today. And we're very glad to have join us from Washington, D.C., National Archives Museum, curator Alice Kamps. Alice, thank you very much for joining us. How are you today?
I'm well. Thank you so much for having me, Bruce. I'm thrilled to be here and share a little information about our exhibit.
Well, we're excited as well. We want to give you some background information on Alice. Let me recalibrate my PowerPoint here. Just a moment, please. Give me just one moment. All right, there we go. So some of Alice's many credentials shown here. Alice has been the curator at the National Archives since back in 2009. Prior to that, she worked as an independent exhibition developer, 2003 to 08. Also director of programs at the 10 Chimneys Foundation, and has served as director of arts learning at Chicago Children's Museum. As we get started, Alice, tell us about how you arrived at the National Archives back in 2009.
Well, my husband and I relocated to Washington, D.C. For a position that he had. And I had been in the museum field for, as you can see, for a couple of decades by then, and was looking for a job. And the National Archives position opened up, and I was absolutely thrilled to be selected to be a curator for their museum.
Well, certainly a prestigious position and a prestigious museum. We're glad that your career has gone so well, and you've done a nice job putting together this new exhibit, All-American, the Power of Sports. It did open just a couple of weeks ago, September 16th. It is a temporary exhibit, but it'll be up for all of next year, and then the first week of 2024. Alice, how did the idea for this exhibit come about? Where did it start, and where did you have to kind of pick up the ball from there?
Great question. I think it started with the realization that the National Archives has wonderful records about sports. The National Archives holds the records of the federal government, but people are sometimes surprised at the breadth and scope of those records, which really touch on all aspects of our lives. And so over the years, we've done various journal articles and blog posts and so forth about some of the wonderful sports records. And then we realized, this would make a fantastic exhibit. So once we'd settled on sports, I picked it up from there, and I started learning about how much sports was involved in the formation of our national identity, and how the different powers of sports have been used by the United States throughout the years. And so the exhibit is divided into 4 sections that cover these different powers, if you will. The first is the power to unite, and that photo on the right of President Bush is a good example of that. The next is the power to teach. And during the progressive era, sports were used a great deal to teach American values in the belief that they would help create good American citizens. Mm-hmm. We also look at the power of sports to promote a positive image of the United States around the world through Olympic and other international competitions, and through the use of athletes as diplomats in foreign countries. And then finally, we look at the power that athletes have to break social barriers, gender, ethnic and racial barriers, and then finally to use their platforms to protest injustice.
From the moment that the staff came up with the idea for this exhibit, how long did it take to create and complete the exhibit? I know it was several years, but can you give us a more precise timetable?
This one had a little bit longer runway than a typical exhibit because it was delayed by the pandemic. So it's been about 4 years since I started doing research on the project.
So was it originally going to open in 2019 or 20?
Yes, that's right.
Well, it is here 2022, and based on the photos that I've seen of it, it certainly looks terrific. You can see just a few of the slides, and we're going to talk about some of the photographs featured here in the title slide. So it's been up for just a couple of weeks. What kind of feedback have you heard, either from staff or visitors, maybe indirectly?
People are really excited about it. It's, sports, of course, it's pretty universally, subject that's there's universal interest in, and it's fun, and they're wonderful artifacts. And so the reception's just been really positive, excuse me. I think there's something there for everyone, even people who may not be, rabid sports fans. They'll be fascinated by the history and the importance of sports to our history.
Here is the entry to the exhibit at the National Archives Museum in Washington. The exhibit, as we can see, or the gallery above the doorway, the Lawrence F. O'Brien Gallery. And I'm sure some sports fans are going to recognize that name. Lawrence O'Brien was the longtime commissioner of the National Basketball Association, but he also had very important ties to the world of politics and government. Tell us about that.
He was an advisor to John F. Kennedy. And in fact, we have a baseball that John F. Kennedy gave to him. It was one that JFK had thrown out, a ceremonial first pitch on opening day, and signed and gave to him. But his family endowed this exhibition space, which is our temporary exhibition space. And his son is on our foundation board, the National Archives Foundation.
Very good. How large is the gallery? How many different rooms are included?
The gallery is one large space. It's relatively large, 3,000 square feet. And for each exhibit, we build temporary walls to divide the space into different sections.
The length of this exhibit, which is a little bit more than a year, I guess close to a year and a half, is that a typical length for a temporary exhibit at the archives?
Yeah, it's about 15 months, and that is a pretty typical length.
One thing I was curious about, and I asked you about this earlier, the image on the right side of the screen, it is a presidential image. Tell us more about it, though.
That is an image of President Truman. He's also engaged in throwing out a ceremonial first pitch, and that is a tradition that goes all the way back to President William Howard Taft. I believe it was in 1910. So for over 100 years, almost every president since Taft has thrown out a ceremonial pitch on opening day. And there's a slideshow that shows that a series of presidents doing that. It's a lot of fun. Oh, yeah. I also want to mention that the National Archives Museum is free. It's open to the public every day except Thanksgiving Day and Christmas Day. So I do hope people will make the trip to DC to see this exhibit and our other exhibitions.
You know, we do a program here, Alice, in our Bullpen Theater about presidents in the pastime. And almost every American president has some kind of a direct or indirect connection to the game. And this tradition of throwing out first pitches, which is now more than a century long, you could almost do an exhibit entirely on presidential first pitches. There have been so many.
Yes, and there are just such wonderful photos of them too. And I love seeing the photos and, how they evolve, how people in the stands changed over the years. And yeah, it's a great subject.
let's look at some of the specific artifacts, photos, documents included here. And we're going to start with a man who, for a long time, people associated with baseball, not as much anymore. For years here at the Hall of Fame, we've been trying to explain to people that Civil War General Abner Doubleday really did not invent the game and really had little tangible connection to the national pastime. But you very interestingly have uncovered at least one connection between Doubleday and the game. Tell us about the letter, which we see on the right side of your screen. And I believe it was written shortly after the Civil War.
Yes, that's correct. As I understand it, it's the only written documentation that connects General Doubleday to baseball that historians have found. And this is a letter that he wrote while he was commanding a unit of Buffalo soldiers at Fort McCabe in Texas. And he wrote this in 1871. And in it, he requests baseball equipment for the entertainment of his men.
That's very interesting. Now, he was a very significant general in the Civil War. Books have actually been written about his military career, even though we now know that there's really not, in terms of baseball, much to speak about with regard to Doubleday. Now, when he wrote this letter, he was essentially on the Western Front all the way out in Texas.
Yes, that's right. It was during the Indian Wars when, after the Civil War, a lot of Army units were posted to protect settlers and people building railroads and involved in other projects in the West from Indian attacks. So these forts were, for the men, it was there was a lot of downtime. There were, many days in between attacks, which they never knew when they were coming. But so they had a lot of time to fill. And apparently baseball was the preferred pastime. It was the favorite activity.
Alice, I'm not sure how much we can read into the letter, but the fact that he took the time to write a letter requesting baseball equipment, it does show that he had some affinity for the game.
I believe so, yes. And clearly he thought that this was a wholesome way for the soldiers to spend their time.
Yeah. It's a fascinating piece, a nice way to start our program. We're going to stay with a military theme here. We're going to advance to the very early days of the 20th century. So what we have here is a poster for a military game. We have Fort Harrison against Fort Missoula. And was this Montana, I believe?
Yes, that's correct.
So these two units are getting ready to participate in a game. And it's a serious enough deal that they actually put up a poster advertising it. I find that fascinating.
Yeah, I do too. And I love the poster. I love the illustration. It's actually quite large. But this was also on the Western frontier. So these were the same types of units posted during this was near the end of the Indian Wars, I believe. But baseball, as you can see, was still very popular. And Fort Missoula is interesting in that it was a place where people crossed rank and racial lines to play together on the baseball team. And that was not something that happened much at that time at all. So they played, of course, people from other forts, like this poster is, this is an example of that. But they also would play local semi-professional teams. It sounds like probably anybody who they could play.
Yeah. So they did have black and white players on the same team.
Yes, and they had officers and soldiers playing, which was also unusual.
Yeah, that might have created some interesting situations. Officers and soldiers mingling in a close athletic way.
I'm sure it did.
Yeah.
But
One
it's
of the
one of
things
those
I really
examples of
like
the power
about-
of sports to bring people together.
Absolutely. I really like the color here. I'm somewhat colorblind, and
Mhm.
I really don't know what color it is. Maybe you can help me on that.
It's it's, I believe in real life, it's a little bit darker than it appears on the screen here, but it's kind of a rusty orange color.
Yeah.
Yeah, I believe that it's the color of the paper that it's printed on.
It looks like it's really nicely done. It's got like a border or a frame around it, kind of
Mhm.
ornate. Looks very professional, and there's the sketches of the players,
Yeah, yeah,
look pretty professional too.
they
It's
do. And
impressive.
I think that they, it shows that people would come to these games and watch them. It was definitely a spectator sport.
Now, a number of the artifacts and documents that you're using in this exhibit come from the Archives Museum itself. Here we have one of the items, though, that is on loan from a place called the Baseball Hall of Fame. So we were able to lend this to you, and it's a fascinating object. 1918, the baseball season came to a premature end. It was not because of the flu pandemic, but it was because of World War I. So they ended the regular season early. They played the World Series early. This ball coming from the Hall of Fame collection, part of your exhibit now. And it was the last baseball hit in the last regular season game, 1918. Pick it up from there, if you will, Alice.
Yeah, so the World War One started well, the United States became involved in 1917, but Major League Baseball continued to play games. They didn't alter their season right away. And they came under a great deal of criticism for that from the public. The public felt like these able-bodied men should be fighting in the war. They should do their part, like other Americans. So the Secretary of War issued what's known as the Work or Fight Order in 1918, which meant that all able-bodied men either had to be fighting, or, as the order kind of clearly expresses, or working in a war-related industry. And it initially didn't apply to baseball players, but after more public outcry, the Secretary of War said, yes, you guys have to do your share too. So that led to this shortened season that you were talking about. And after that, players had to either had to enlist in the war, or they had to go and work in a war-related industry. And some players, like Babe Ruth, were able to work to get jobs in factories which had baseball teams. And this became kind of sarcastically referred to as the Safe Shelter League. So they were able to continue playing baseball, but for factories. So that was their work, the way that they dealt with the work part of the work or fight order.
It's interesting, Alice, that there was this sentiment against the players playing the game, that the priority
Mm-hmm.
was that they should be serving in the military during World War I. And then you contrast that, we're going to talk about it later with FDR, World War II, where he gave the commissioner of baseball permission to keep the game going. And then if you go back more recently to the pandemic a couple of years ago, there were a lot of people pushing for baseball to be played, to resume during the pandemic. And it did get started in July of that year, 3 or 4 months after much of the nation was cut down. So it's kind of interesting how some of these public attitudes regarding baseball players playing under emergency circumstances kind of changed over time.
That's right. Yeah, and I think that the way that the two wars were kind of sold in a way to the American people by the government was very different between World War I and World War II. World War I was very much about service. It's everyone's duty to sacrifice for the war. And in World War II, you can see this change in the propaganda posters. Those posters were very much influenced by the advertising industry, which was fairly new at the time. So they emphasized much more this sort of idea that, there are going to be certain benefits for you for helping us win the war, and and also trying to make it look fun and almost glamorous in a way sometimes.
Getting back to the game, which this ball is connected to, again, it was the last regular season game. It was played at Navin Field, home of the Detroit Tigers. They were hosting the Chicago White Sox. I love the fact that the last ball was caught by Davy Jones, which always makes me think of the lead singer of the Monkees, but obviously no relation there. So this ended the regular season officially, but then we still had the World Series that had to be
Right.
played. And you were telling me the other day that the World Series in 1918 really didn't help the pandemic. It really ended up spreading the flu that was already running rampant.
That's right. They believe that it was the 1918 World Series in Boston and all the rallies and parades and other events around it, along with the games, that became a super spreader event that was responsible for the second deadly wave of the pandemic
Yeah.
in that next fall.
You mentioned a moment ago Babe Ruth, and that leads us into this next artifact, another
Yes.
fascinating item. So here we have Babe Ruth's draft card, also from 1918. So during World War I, many major league players were exposed to the military draft. Babe Ruth, who at the time, well-known pitcher with the Boston Red Sox, he was not excluded from that. So here we have his official draft registration card. What's the information that you think is most pertinent, Alice, that we can glean from this card?
Well, probably the most pertinent to Babe Ruth was line 10, where it indicates that he was married. And at the time, married men were not required to serve. So that enabled him to avoid going into service and fighting. You know, interestingly, I was traveling on Monday with my son to look at colleges, and we passed Bethlehem Steel in Pennsylvania. I had never seen this building before, but that's where Babe Ruth played that was the league that he played in for that factory. It's quite an amazing looking building.
Is the factory still active?
No, it's been turned into an art center, I
Oh,
believe.
really?
Yeah, but it's just this giant rusty system of tubes, and it's quite a sight. I'd kind of like to go back and photograph it.
Yeah. But apparently the interior has been renovated to the point where they can feature exhibits.
Yes, yes. And I think
Do we
they
have
have
any sense of
performances
whether
as well.
Babe Ruth actually had to do work in the factory, or was it mostly just playing ball?
My sense is it was a pretty cushy
Yeah,
position. It was mostly playing ball.
right. Very interesting. We had talked a little bit about the numbers on the registration card. There's kind of a long serial number in the upper left-hand corner.
Hmm.
But then on the right side, we see number 28. And then we also see 28 highlighted in some kind of a blue marker. Do we know, were you able to figure out what those numbers represented?
Unfortunately, I haven't been able to yet. I'm going to keep after that though, and I will let you know
Okay.
so that you can share that with your viewers.
One other interesting note, if you look at the bottom, it appears he does sign it George Ruth, not Babe. So he had to make it official with his first name. But a fascinating document that I had never seen before you sent it to me just about a week ago. Babe Ruth's draft card, 1918. All right, staying with the issue of the war, but jumping ahead to the Second World War, another really interesting piece here. So this is the famous letter that Commissioner Landis sent to President Roosevelt in 1942, asking FDR whether baseball should continue during World War II. Now, this is not the green light letter. The green light letter was FDR's response. This is the initial letter. I guess some have called it or nicknamed it the red light letter. But a very interesting letter. The first thing that jumps out at me, it's handwritten by Landis. It's not typed. FDR's response was typewritten. Kind of jumps out at you that it's handwritten, right?
It does. And my favorite documents are always the handwritten ones because you can kind of read more into the mood and situation of the person writing it.
What do you think was Landis's primary motivation in writing this letter? What was he trying to find out from the president? What kind of a response message was he looking for?
I think that he was very concerned about the negative press that Major League Baseball got during World War I. and wanted to kind of walk a careful line with the president, and not. I'm sure he wanted to appear patriotic and in support of the war, but also as the commissioner of baseball, I'm sure he was very interested in allowing it to continue in some way.
You really think he was trying to have the president take him, the commissioner, off the hook? People are getting on my case about baseball, whether we should continue or not. I'd like the decision to be made from a higher source.
Absolutely, yeah. If the president says it's okay to continue baseball, that does that, and in fact, as you know, and probably a lot of your viewers know, President Roosevelt did say that baseball should continue, and that the American people needed that kind of release from all the stresses and strains that the war occasioned. Of course, and he made it seem almost patriotic to continue baseball in service of the war effort.
Of course, we've both seen, I know many of our viewers have seen the green light letter, which was FDR's response. He never came out and made it like a direct order and said, you've got to do this. But you read between the lines, I think he made it pretty clear that, keeping baseball going is the way to go.
He did. And he did also, of course, say that able-bodied players should serve, but that other players who were not eligible for service should continue to help the American people kind of forget their troubles.
Alice, what about the photograph on the left? It's a ceremonial first pitch.
Yes.
Looks like Washington against New York. What year would that be from?
Oh, gosh. I'm sorry, I don't remember what year that one's from. I think it's early 40s.
Yeah. Now, interesting that he is standing up. We know in his later years that he was in a wheelchair. So he was at this point healthy enough that he could actually stand up and get that right arm high in the air and throw that ceremonial first pitch.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. But really interesting correspondence between Landis and the commissioner. We had talked a little bit about the fact that these two gentlemen really didn't care for each other all that much, but they were able to put any of that animosity aside. You certainly don't sense the animosity in the letters, at least not that what I've read. So they were able to work together and find a solution, even though they came from different sides of the political spectrum.
It's my understanding that this is kind of the culmination of a campaign. I guess other people had been campaigning with the president, like Mr. Wrigley, for example, to allow baseball to continue. So Mr. Landis may have had a sense that he was going to get a positive response.
Right. We're going to jump back in time. We're going to go back from 1942 to 1925 to talk about this next document. And this is as fascinating as any of the materials that you've shared with us. So what we have here, this is Rube Foster's letter. Rube Foster, by this point, has started the Negro National League. He has started what we now consider the Negro Leagues. He'd been a prominent player, manager, then became owner of the Chicago American Giants, and as the Giants owner, also became the founder of Negro Leagues baseball. And what Foster is trying to do here, he's sending a letter to a local parole board, part of his effort to acquire a player named Roy Tyler. Roy Tyler was playing for the Kansas City Monarchs, another Negro Leagues team, but he was on parole. And in order for Foster to acquire Tyler in a transaction and essentially kind of take him under his wing and I guess be his protector or overlooker, if you will, he had to have permission from the parole board to do this. So this is Foster making his argument, I guess, that I need this man and he's okay to work for my team.
Yeah, this was part of a really fascinating prison to professional baseball pipeline that developed at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. And the reason that we have these records is because it's a federal institution, and of course we have all the records of the federal government. So we have this fascinating a document where Roy Tyler is signing up to be what was called at the time the first friend, which really just means a parole advisor or supervisor. And Roy Tyler was one of, there were, I believe, 3 other men who played baseball at Leavenworth and developed, professional level skills. They played for a team called the Booker T's. And Leavenworth Prison was segregated at the time, so there was also a white team that they played against, and they almost always beat the white team.
It's interesting that the letter turned out to be successful, because not only did Tyler end up playing for the Chicago franchise in 25, but he also played in 26 and 33. So he did play parts of 3 seasons. So Foster was convincing. What were the original charges that Tyler had faced?
He was charged with mutiny from the 1917 Houston riot. He was in a military unit that was a Black military unit that was stationed in Houston that was harassed by the public and the police there. And they, at the time, believed that one of their men had been murdered by a police officer. And they took to the streets, and several people were killed. And several men were hanged after the court martial, after the trial. And this was quite a devastating incident for the country.
Do we know if Tyler had direct involvement, or did he just get caught wrong place, wrong time?
We don't know, but they court-martialed, I believe it was like 64 men. So a huge number of men were swept up in these trials, and they were all tried together as a group. They had one military officer who was representing them, but he wasn't a lawyer. And so the trial, and especially the hanging, the execution of the men involved in this, came under a great deal of criticism. And later he was originally sentenced to life, but that was commuted to a sentence of 20 years with possibility of parole at 7. So that is how he was able to leave to play professional baseball.
While no one would defend murder, do you think we can safely say that this might have been an overreaction to punish these men?
It certainly appears that way. I believe there were, fewer than, I think it was around 11 people died in the riot. So it's unlikely that all 64 men committed murder, obviously.
Leavenworth is always kind of an interesting topic. You watch old television shows and old movies, and you hear people joke and say, if you don't behave, we're going to send you off to Leavenworth. How bad was Leavenworth?
I am afraid I can't comment on that. But I do know that baseball was considered a way to give the prisoners an outlet, and a healthy, opportunity to exercise. So I think that was part of an attempt at some reforms.
And you do think this was fairly common with Negro Leagues teams trying to get players through parole boards? This was not an isolated situation.
I don't believe it was common. I think that, there were 4 men, I believe, who went from Leavenworth to professional baseball, but I don't believe there were, I'm not aware of any others.
Oh, okay. Very interesting story, and one that I had never heard of. We teach about the Negro Leagues here at the Hall of Fame in our exhibits, in our educational units, and this was one aspect of the story completely new to me. So really fascinating stuff. Here we have very interesting artwork. This is America, keep it free. This is essentially a propaganda poster that was put out by the Office of War Information in 1942. What was the purpose of the poster? What were they trying to do?
This is one of a series of posters that was created by a private poster company for the Office of War Information to be hung in factories. And the purpose of the series was to inspire the workers who were helping to produce munitions and ships and other things for the war effort, to inspire them to work hard. And they were doing it through these ideals of America and appealing to their patriotism, and also a vision of kind of an ideal life that they can go back to after the war is over. And so fascinating that they used baseball, and that they used, actually this is a photograph that a photographer named Dorothy Lang took during the Great Depression. And they colorized the image and kind of pepped it up for the poster series. But I think, baseball really speaks to some of America's fondest ideals, that idea that anyone can make the big leagues. If you have the talent and you put in the work, anybody can make it in this country. So I find this a really interesting poster.
It is propaganda, but my sense is it was probably pretty effective.
Yeah, I could see that. I could definitely see that. Yeah, I believe it was.
Yeah. And just to clarify, this poster was not meant to recruit soldiers.
Right.
It was really meant to motivate the factory workers, to tell them, hey, you're important to the war effort. We need you to really put in an effort, not go through the motions. What you're doing is really important as part of the war effort.
That's right. That's right.
Mm-hmm. Dorothy Lang, we're going to talk a little bit more about her in a moment. Very famous photographer, probably best known for her Depression era imagery. She came up with a number of photos that remain iconic to this day, but was still creating this kind of photographic art, if you will, in the 1940s, though this one, as you mentioned, was altered, probably without her permission. But we talk about one of the great photographers in American history, certainly Dorothy Lang has to be included on that list. Here we have another wartime, well, actually not a wartime related issue, but an issue that sort of ties into the whole relationship between Japanese Americans and baseball. This was something that would come up repeatedly, 1920s, 1930s, certainly in the 1940s when the Japanese incarceration camps were begun. So this photo, which is actually part of the Hall of Fame collection, is from a barnstorming game, 1927 in Fresno, California. And that is where this Japanese American, Kenichi Zenemura, lived. He was a player, but also a promoter, an organizer of the game. He was somebody that actually organized a league of Japanese American players in Fresno. And apparently his teams were so famous, both nationally and internationally, that when Lou Gehrig and Babe Ruth arrived in Fresno with their barnstorming teams, they actually asked Zenemura to take part in the game along with these three other Japanese Americans. Fascinating.
Yes, and Zenemura, who is the man standing between Gehrig and Ruth in this photograph, is a really fascinating character, and we'll learn more about him when we talk about the Japanese baseball at the Japanese internment camps. But like Black Americans, Japanese Americans could not play baseball on the major league team, so they had their own leagues in the West Coast.
Obviously, Ruth and Gehrig thought enough of him and these other guys to include him. Granted, it's an exhibition game. Maybe they're not going all out, but they don't want to just have guys who can't play. These guys have to have some serious ball playing ability. I guess what jumps out at you about the photograph is how short Zenemura is compared to Gehrig and Ruth. Of course, they were above average sized men for that era. But here's this little guy, and he was a terrific player.
That's my understanding. Yeah, then a lot of these guys were great players.
Yeah. The names of the barnstorming teams are kind of amusing. Ruth's team was called the Bustin' Babes, and Lou Gehrig's team, which barnstormed in the winter as well, was called the Larrapin Lou's. I've never been able to figure out what the word Larrapin means. Maybe one
Yeah.
day we'll figure that out. But they did play in this exhibition game in Fresno, California. And I was doing a little bit of research, Alice, about Zenemora. You know, he is
Mm,
still a legendary figure in Japan
mm.
and among Japanese Americans. Books have been written about him. This is somebody that, in terms of the Asian community, really almost a godlike figure.
Mm.
All right, we're going to stay with the subject of Japanese American players, but now we're going to move to the World War II years and the incarceration centers or camps. So here is a very striking photo. This is a baseball game that was played in 1942 at Manzanar, California. Was what was called an incarceration center. Sometimes we hear the word internment. I guess internment maybe makes it sound a little more palatable. Incarceration sounds maybe more accurate, certainly a tougher word.
Mhm.
Tell us about what we see here and how popular these games were.
So during World War II, after the attacks on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese, there was great concern about citizens of and residents of Japanese descent in the United States, and concerned that they would be disloyal. So President Roosevelt ordered 110,000 Japanese Americans and residents of Japanese descent into these, what were known at the time as internment camps. And you're right that that was a term that I think made it sound more palatable, but it is more accurate to call them incarceration centers, because they were forcibly removed and sent to, I believe there were 10 of them in the western part of the United States. This one is Manzanar. Manzanar, California is near Death Valley. A lot of these camps were in desert areas, kind of pretty desolate. They were surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by armed guards. But baseball was a very popular way to not only pass the time in these camps, but as one Japanese American described it, it was a way to wrap yourself in the American flag, to proclaim the Japanese proclaim their loyalty to the United States and their identity as Americans through the game. Dorothy Lang, the photographer we've been talking about, took this photo. She worked for what was called the War Relocation Authority, whose records we have at the National Archives, and documented camps, but also took very detailed notes that and captioned the photos with a great deal of information. And the caption for this photo explains that this is one of 80 teams that were formed just at Manzanar. Manzanar held about 10,000 people. So it was a huge camp. But 80 teams were formed there. So this was, fun for the players. Clearly was also a big spectator sport. Lots of people came to watch the games. So very popular form of entertainment at the camps.
So the Japanese prisoners, if you will, participated in these games. And then we see a number of fans come out. Who's comprising the fan base? Is that just other prisoners?
Other prisoners, yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. Mm-hmm.
very interesting. You can see why Lang was such a great photographer. Just the layout here. You see a
Mm.
fairly large crowd of fans to watch, obviously, a non-professional game, an exhibition game, but then set against the backdrop, those tiny little houses where these
Yeah.
folks had to live, and then the
Mm-hmm.
huge mountain, which almost serves as a barrier to this camp.
Mm.
I mean, it's all there.
No, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, it's just an incredibly powerful photograph, and amazing. How many teams did you say were at Manzanar?
80. She noted there are over 80 teams formed there.
Wow.
It's amazing. And
Now, it's not just
you can see these photos and hundreds of others on our website, the National Archives.
very good. Women also played in these games. Here we have a team known as the Chickadee softball team. And this also took place at Manzanar. Hard to see if there's much of a crowd because we can only, see a very kind of tight angle behind the plate. It looks like the ladies watching the game are having a good time. And I guess even the two ladies playing are enjoying it as well. But women had this activity that they enjoyed also.
Clearly, yes. And I suspect that this photograph was posed to some degree, but I think those smiles are genuine.
Interesting. So both men and women among these Japanese prisoners participating in these games, they did provide recreation, but as you said a moment ago, they did show patriotism. There's no more patriotic or baseball-centric game or American-centric game than baseball. And if you play baseball, maybe a sign that you do love the country as well. Now that brings us into something else that went on during the World War II era, but also into the 1950s. And you have, as part of this exhibit, some really wonderful film that was shot in the 1950s. So here we have All-American Baseball League game that was being played in Alexandria, Virginia. We're going to show you this video. It's a couple of minutes long. It's going to start out with silent footage. And then there's going to be a narrator who makes some rather interesting comments. I'll put it that way. We'll talk about those comments on the other side. So again, this is silent footage from the All-American League, early 1950s. Not a huge crowd, but a few fans there.
And this is actually, this first clip is from the early 1930s. It's a semi-professional league in Oakland, California.
Time baseball brings out the All-American Girl Baseball League for spring training at Alexandria, Virginia. Two teams are working out, the Fort Wayne Daisies and the Racine Bells, getting in shape for an opening day doubleheader. Dottie Schroeder is quite confident that her hair won't get in her eyes. And keeping her eye on the ball is catcher Kate Fondreau. Okay, gals, play ball. Matt Scott has quite a curve, but this one is wide. Gene Marlowe is willing to wait. Gene bunts it. The squeeze is on. Tibby Ison slides home with a run and a nicely bruised leg. Better a bruise than long pants, eh, gals? Joe Weaver hits the long ball, almost out of the ballpark. Boy, that clears the base paths. And inside the park homer by a whisker.
I imagine, Alice, if some of the players heard that narration, especially the remark about better a bruise, gals, than long pants, they would have wanted to slap him.
Yeah, pretty cringy.
Yeah, because we know those players, for the most part, did not like wearing skirted uniforms.
Yeah.
Many of them put up a mild protest, but they were basically told they had no choice. They tried to improvise with sliding pads and things like that. But that was certainly a point of contention. They did not like skirted uniforms at all.
Yeah. Well, understandable. And it in doing research for this exhibit, I was really kind of shocked at how deeply held beliefs about the inappropriateness of sports for women, how long those persisted and how strong they were. I think there's still some of that today.
Yeah. We don't see a lot of footage of women playing baseball in the 1930s or women playing in the All-American League. We see a lot of still photographs, but seeing the footage of them playing, that really kind of strikes me. I haven't seen a lot of that. And it does give you an image. I don't know how accurate. I think some of that action that we saw was probably staged, and certainly the announcer's a bit of a distraction with his comments, but at least does give us a little bit of a taste of what women's baseball looked like. So again, this from the Motion Picture Archives. And actually, well, we don't want to repeat that, so we're going to jump ahead here. But great footage, and folks can see that in the exhibit, right? They can watch the video. Alice, I think your microphone has been muted. I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Thank you. Sorry, there's a lawnmower, and so I muted myself and it wouldn't let me unmute. Sorry. So I'm sorry, Bruce. What was your question?
You know, I think it's interesting to be able to see, you know, some of this footage.
Oh, yes.
That we don't often get an opportunity to see. You know, most of our imagery of the All-American League is through still photographs, and maybe the movie A League of Their Own, which is great. It's a terrific movie. It's funny. It's dramatic. It's accurate in many ways, but still a movie. And to get to see what these players look like, even though some of it's staged, it does give us a taste of what women's baseball looked like back in the 40s and 50s.
Yeah, and you certainly can see the athleticism. You know, they were clearly athletes, and they were playing hard.
We're going to stay in the era of the 1940s with this next document. It's a relatively long letter that was written by Jackie Robinson, and it's regarding that infamous military bus incident which took place in 1942. Here's the background. Robinson was arrested and charged with a crime after an incident on a military bus. He was a lieutenant in the U.S. Army at the time. My understanding was that he was wearing his lieutenant uniform. He sat toward the front of the bus. The driver of the bus said, "No, you're black. You have to sit in the back of the bus." Robinson argued with him rightly and said, "Well, I'm a lieutenant in the Army. I should be able to sit wherever there's an empty seat." This led to an argument. I don't believe it was a physical confrontation, but it was a verbal confrontation between the two. Robinson ends up getting charged with a crime. So shortly after that happens, he ends up writing this letter. Tell us who he wrote it to and what he was trying to find out in writing this in this letter.
Yeah, so Lieutenant Robinson was charged with insubordination and I think conduct unbecoming an officer. And he's writing to a man named Truman K. Gibson, who was an assistant to the Secretary of War. He's someone that he had had interactions with in the past. He knew this man, but he's basically asking him for advice about the incident. He's wondering if he should go to the NAACP and the Black press to publicize it. This is in between the incident and the trial, and he's wondering if some press or negative press against the military basically would help him in the trial. Gibson wrote back and I believe advised him not to go to the press, but to keep him apprised of what happens. And Gibson wrote the handwritten annotations that you can see in the first page of the letter. He noted that Robinson was quite well known for playing football at the time. This is before his baseball career, obviously. But he's saying, this is a well-known athlete. We should really watch this.
So Gibson had a sense this was a pretty important situation developing.
Yes, absolutely.
It's interesting that the letter is written on a hospital letterhead.
Right.
Pulaski General Hospital in Temple, Texas. Why was Robinson in the hospital at the time?
He was being treated for a football injury. Actually, something had happened to his ankle. So he was actually coming from the hospital and returning to the base when the incident on the bus occurred.
Robinson didn't necessarily get the response that he was looking for, the help that he was looking for, but the story does essentially have a happy ending. Robinson is court-martialed. It goes to military tribunal, and he's found not guilty on all the charges. And we believe this is an incident that Branch Rickey knew about, may have factored into his decision to essentially select Robinson as the first player to break the color barrier by 1947. This is one of two different Jackie Robinson letters included in the exhibit. The second one is much later. Again, this first one is from the 1940s. This is from 1960. And by this time, Robinson has retired as a player. He's now an executive with the Chock Full of Nuts Coffee Company in New York City. And he is writing to Richard Nixon, who at the time was Vice President of the United States. And at the time, these two men were basically friends and allies, correct?
Yes, Robinson supported Nixon in his campaign for president.
In this letter, Robinson isn't really complaining about Nixon, but he's complaining about his presidential partner, if you will, Dwight Eisenhower. What's the gist of the complaint?
Well, Robinson is wondering if, Nixon has said that he is going to carry on with Eisenhower's policies and agenda. And so basically, Robinson is asking him, does that include civil rights? Because Eisenhower was admonishing American people, Black Americans, to be patient, to not try to rush change. And this was deeply frustrating for Jackie Robinson.
I'm guessing that Nixon's response to the letter was perhaps not what Jackie wanted to hear, may have been the start of a bit of a falling out between them.
I don't know if the falling out started here, but it certainly was a falling out. Jackie Robinson became frustrated with Nixon's positions on civil rights, but also changed his view on President Kennedy through some interactions that he had with him.
Robinson did support Nixon during his initial presidential run, but not during his second run, correct?
That's right.
Yeah. So very interesting direct correspondence between Jackie Robinson and President Nixon, or Vice President Nixon at the time. This is the kind of correspondence that I'm almost afraid we'll lose in future years, because so much of what is sent today is email, and then it's deleted, and we don't necessarily have hard copies of it.
Yeah.
But thankfully, we do have hard copies from the 40s, 50s, and 60s.
Yes. And as I said, the handwritten letters, or letters like this one that have handwritten annotations, I think provide you a much better kind of view and window into the past and what was happening. So I agree. I think that will be a loss.
The annotations that are on the side and the top of the letter,
Mm-hmm.
do we know if those were written by Robinson or someone else?
Those, I suspect, were written by someone working with President Nixon, probably taking notes as he's talking about how to respond to this letter.
Alice, one final slide that I want to talk about, and
Yes.
it's chronologically the most recent item of everything we've discussed. It's now 21 years ago, 2001 World Series, only weeks after September 11th. A famous photograph, Joe Torre, Yankee manager, on the left, Bob Brenly, Arizona Diamondbacks manager, on the right. This is from the World Series, President George Bush in the middle. As we know, President Bush threw out the ceremonial first pitch. It was prior to Game 3 of that series. He threw pretty much a perfect strike, drew a raucous reaction from the crowd. You see this photograph, Bush looking rather triumphant with his right hand or right arm elevated. What do you think this moment meant for America, especially coming so close after September 11th?
I think this was just a huge moment for the United States, and maybe the first moment after the attacks of 9/11 when the country felt united against the forces that attacked us. As I was speaking about earlier, one of the powers of sports is to make people feel united and part of a community. And President Bush showed great bravery in coming to the stadium that day and throwing out the pitch. He's wearing a bulletproof vest underneath that New York Fire Department jacket that he's wearing, which is in the exhibition, by the way. And he was advised, by many people not to do it, but he felt it was important. And after he threw the pitch, the crowd burst into spontaneous chants of USA, USA, USA. And from what I understand from people who were there, and President Bush himself said it was one of the most powerful things he'd ever experienced.
Is the jacket part of the permanent collection at the museum?
It is. So all of the presidential libraries are part of the National Archives. And so this comes from the Bush Library and it's part of their permanent collection.
Yeah. A lot of things we've talked about today are things that we don't remember firsthand. We're simply not old enough. But this is certainly something we do remember. It doesn't seem like it was 21, 22 years ago. It seems a lot more recent than that. And it's perhaps even more powerful to now see it in terms of the photograph, but also in terms of the actual jacket. As you mentioned, it does have the NYFD logo on it, along with President Bush's name stenciled in it. Very powerful image from that 2000 World Series. Setting aside the importance of the significance of this photograph, it was a great series too. The final result was not what I wanted. I'm a Yankee fan, but it was a tremendous series. The Yankees had some remarkable comeback wins in the games at Yankee Stadium. And then after a blowout in Game 6, Game 7 was a very tight fought game that essentially went down to the final batter. A very memorable World Series on so many different fronts. But you'll see that photograph and you can see the actual jacket that belonged to President Bush if you visit the museum archives. One of the things that we want to do is encourage people to take a look at the website. And I think we may have lost the link that I put up. We had to go to our secondary program. So I want to read out what that link is. And I'm going to type it into the chat room as well. So it's museum.archives.gov, /all-American. So if you want to visit the exhibit online, museum.archives.gov/all-American, and all-American is hyphenated as well. And I'm going to put that into the chat so that people can take a look at that. When folks go to the website, Alice, and take a look at the exhibit, how much of what is actually on exhibit will they be able to see through photographs and imagery?
That's a good question. There are just a handful of photographs of the documents and artifacts on display, but there is an 8-minute video tour where I take you through the exhibit so you can get a much better sense of the space and see more and learn more about the display items.
Now, of course, what we really would like people to do is to visit the exhibit and see it in person. There's nothing quite like doing that in person. And folks can do that as well. There is a site where people can get tickets. They don't have to purchase them. They're free of charge. It's recreation.gov, recreation.gov. And I'm going to type that in as well. And if you go to recreation.gov and you type in National Archives Museum, it will take you to the area where you can reserve tickets ahead of time. And that's a great way to do that, just to make sure that you can get in at the time that you want, because I believe you're still doing time ticketing, correct?
No, you can just show up, come to the door, but there are times when there are long lines, especially during, holiday breaks and summertime. So we do advise you make a reservation in advance, especially during those busy times, but you don't need a time ticket at this point.
Yeah. All right, well, thanks for clarifying that. So again, that website, we put it in the chat room, is recreation.gov. And then if you want to see the website, the exhibit online, museum.archives.gov/All-American. And again, All-American is hyphenated. And this is certainly something that we encourage you to do. The busy times, Alice, Saturdays and Sundays?
Busy times are really, the school breaks like Christmas break or spring break, or, the day after Thanksgiving and the weekend after Thanksgiving. And then much of the summer is very busy. Other than that, it isn't bad at all.
Yeah. And as you said, you're open 7 days a week.
Yes.
362 days a year?
Yes, 363, I think. Just Christmas and Thanksgiving were closed.
So you're open on New Year's. You
Yep.
have us beat there. We're closed on New Year's. That's why I was thinking of 362. Yeah. It is a terrific exhibit. I'm hoping to get down there. I've actually never been to Washington, believe it or not.
Oh, please do
Not been to the
come. We'd
National
love to have you.
Archives. So if I come down there, you'll let me in, right?
I will let you in. I will take you on a tour myself. I would be delighted.
Yeah. For those that want to see the exhibit in person, how much time should they give to really get a sense of what's included?
In the exhibition or in the
Yeah.
whole museum? Because of course
The
you'll want to
exhibition
see-
itself.
Yeah, the exhibition itself, it depends on your attention span. An hour would be good, 2 hours would be better.
So 1 to 2 hours to give you a sense of the exhibit. And if you wanted to go through the rest of the museum, well, I guess you could be there for several days, right?
You could certainly spend the day there, but
Yeah. Well, Alice, I want to thank you for being with us over this past hour to talk about this exhibit that you have created, All-American, the Power of Sports. Just opened up in mid-September. Will continue until January 7th of 2024. Keep us up to date on how things are going there. And I hope a lot of our viewers can go. And I'm hoping that I'll be able to go maybe sometime in 2023. But Alice, we really do appreciate your time. Thank you.
Oh, Bruce, thank you so much for having me. It was absolutely wonderful to share with everyone. Thank you.
And we're not done with the National Archives, because next Thursday, we are going to again be featuring the National Archives in a discussion about Roberto Clemente. That's a program that's going to be later in the day. It's going to be at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. We are going to talk about Roberto Clemente with Hall of Famer Edgar Martinez, and also with a gentleman named Rodney Slater. He was once Secretary of Transportation for President Bill Clinton, and is now one of the high-ranking executives at the National Archives. So Rodney Slater, Edgar Martinez will join us next Thursday, 5 p.m. Eastern, for that program. So we are not done with this wonderful museum world in Washington, D.C. Thank you again, Alice. Thank you for all those folks who have joined us today. We hope you've enjoyed the program along with all of our other programs. And if you visit our YouTube channel for the Hall of Fame, you can watch this program and all the other shows that we've done over the last couple of years. Thanks for being with us. Have a great day, everybody. Take care.
Bye.